Tyreek Hill, 32 years old, a rebuilt knee, and ESPN just said out loud what nobody in the DMV is ready to confirm yet, that Washington should sign him before training camp. But in a minute, I'm gonna tell you exactly why this move has a ticking bomb buried inside it that Adam Peters cannot ignore. And it's not the knee. And while that plays out, Odafe Oweh opened up this week about what Durante Jones is building out in Ashburn, and what he described explains exactly why Washington handed that man $96 million. But there's also a specific weakness in this scheme that opposing quarterbacks are already studying on film, and I'm breaking it down before Quinn gets a chance to patch it. And to close, mandatory minicamp wrapped up, and the way Dan Quinn structured those 3 days was no accident. There's a very clear message in how he divided those reps, and that message completely changes the conversation about who's making this roster and who's getting cut before the season kicks off. Raise hail, let's get into it. I am going to start by saying something that is probably going to make some of you uncomfortable. I think Aaron Schatz from ESPN is right. Not completely, not without some enormous asterisks, but right at the core of the argument. The Commanders need a second receiver. They need one badly, and right now, the free agent market does not have a lot of options that actually move the needle. So let us look at this with total honesty, as fans who want to win a Super Bowl, not as journalists who have to stay neutral. Let us start from the beginning, because a lot of people are reacting to the name without understanding the actual situation. Tyreek Hill, 32 years old, was released by Miami on February 22nd. The Dolphins cleared $22.5 million in cap space by letting him walk, primarily because of a devastating injury. In week 4 of last season, playing against the Jets, Hill suffered a dislocated left knee with multiple torn ligaments, including the ACL. If you watch that play live, you know exactly what I am talking about. It was one of those images you just do not want to see in football. And from that moment on, the question surrounding Hill is not whether he was ever great. Everyone knows he was one of the best wide receivers of the last decade, probably a Hall of Famer. The question is whether he can come back and be relevant after an injury of that magnitude. And that question, man, is what makes this whole conversation so genuinely complicated. Schatz wrote that the Commanders could use a solid number 2 receiver and a field stretcher who is a step up from Dyami Brown, and that is literally true. After Terry McLaurin, who also comes off an injury-riddled 2025 season himself, Washington's receiver core on the outside is pretty thin right now, not terrible. Just not the kind of group that forces defensive coordinators to change their coverage structure. Dyami Brown can make plays in space, but nobody in the league is adjusting their game plan because of Dyami Brown. Tyreek Hill and his prime made defensive coordinators lose sleep the night before a game. That is the gap between what you have and what you could have. But here's where I need to be completely straight with y'all about the part of this argument that nobody is articulating honestly enough. The question is not whether Tyreek Hill is good. The question is how much of that Tyreek Hill is left after October 12th, 2025. A dislocated knee with an ACL tear is an injury that for any NFL player changes a season and changes a career. For a wide receiver whose entire game depends on explosive speed and the ability to cut on a dime, that injury is potentially career-altering in a permanent way. Hill did not have extra speed to spare. His game was pure speed, impossible cut angles, and the ability to make a defense account for him even when he did not touch the ball. If he loses 10% of that speed after knee surgery, he stops being Tyreek Hill and becomes just a veteran receiver with good football IQ. That has value, but it is not the same thing. SpotRack projects him at a 2-year, $30.1 million contract. I honestly wonder if that is anywhere near what he wants, especially since he has not played since October of last year. If the Commanders get involved, and I am speculating here, it is probably with something more conservative, something like 1 year, $10 million with performance incentives. That protects the team if the knee does not hold up, and it gives Hill the chance to prove he can play and chase a bigger deal afterwards. That structure makes sense for both sides, but there is one part of this conversation that most beat reporters are deliberately dodging, and I am not going to do that. Tyreek Hill's personal record is being completely straight with you, a real problem, not a narrative problem, not a public relations problem. A real character concern that any serious organization has to evaluate before writing a check. In the last 3 years alone, Hill was investigated for an alleged assault at a marina in June of 2023. He was successfully sued for paternity by 2 separate women in December of 2023. He was sued by a social media influencer who alleged he broke her leg in 2024. And in April of 2025, his mother-in-law called the police to their home over an alleged domestic incident, though no charges were filed. His wife, Kita Vaccaro, filed for divorce the next day. That is not the record of someone who had a single mistake in his youth and grew from it. That is a pattern, and that matters not just morally, but practically. What happens if there is an incident during the season? How does Dan Quinn handle that kind of distraction in the locker room? How do Josh Harris and this organization respond publicly? Is it worth bringing that risk into a team that is actively trying to build identity and culture under a head coach who has made accountability a core part of how he talks about this program? Look, I could be wrong about how this plays out. There are teams that have signed players with complicated personal histories, and it has worked. There are teams that have done the same thing and watched it become a complete disaster. I do not have a crystal ball, but I would not be doing right by you if I ignored that history. Now, the other side of the argument, Washington has the 3rd most available cap space in the league right now, according to Shatz. That is a confirmed fact. They have the money to make this move without compromising the important contracts they will need to extend in the near future, starting with Jaden Daniels. If Hill signs for 1 or 2 years at a relatively modest number, the financial impact is manageable, and there is real tactical value here worth considering. The new system that David Blau is building, which he describes as a more traditional attack with Jaden Daniels under center, relies on the ability to create vertical separation to open up the run game and the play-action passing game. That is exactly what an elite speed receiver does. If Hill is at 75 to 80% of his physical capacity, which is a reasonable estimate for a year after an ACL reconstruction, he is still a receiver that makes defenses stay honest on the deep ball. That affects the spacing of the entire offense. It creates windows for McLaurin on crossing routes. It gives Daniels a vertical explosion option that simply does not exist on the current roster. So where do I land on this? If the knee is at 80% or better, and if Peters can structure a 1-year deal with incentives that protects the team, and if the organization is genuinely confident they can manage the locker room side of this, then yes, you sign him. With all of those asterisks firmly in place, the upside outweighs the risk in a season where the Commanders have a real contention window with Daniels in his 2nd year under Quinn. But every single one of those asterisks matters. This is not a simple decision. It is a complex one that only Peters and Washington's medical staff have the information to make correctly. What bothers me about the current narrative is that too many people are treating this like it is obvious. Like Tyreek Hill is just another free agent waiting for a phone call. He is not. He is a 32-year-old coming off major knee surgery with a personal history that complicates any evaluation. That does not automatically disqualify him, but it is not a clean signing either. There are layers here, and the DMV deserves a front office that works through all of them before committing. Now, while Washington is still figuring out what to do on offense, there is something happening on the defensive side of this team that has me genuinely excited, and I think people are sleeping on it way too hard right now. Odafe Oweh spoke this week about what Durante Jones is building, and what he said was not the kind of generic training camp hype you usually get in June. It was the description of a player who understands exactly why he signed here and exactly why he believes he can break out in this system. Oweh said that Jones has different variations of the same call, and that once you internalize the why behind each variation, when the game comes, you move fast. That the bullets are flying. That is exactly the kind of language you want to hear from an edge rusher that an intelligent organization just handed $96 million. Let us remember who Oweh is and why the Commanders made this investment. The man is 27 years old, 6'4", 257 pounds, with a 4.37 40. Those are the physical numbers of a nightmare pass rusher. Baltimore drafted him, held him for 3 seasons, watched him accumulate 13 sacks over that stretch, and then traded him away for an ordinary cornerback and a day 3 pick. That says something about how the Ravens valued him, and it is a legitimate concern. But here's the thing that changes the entire story. What happened after he landed in Los Angeles last year was completely different. Oweh was traded to the Chargers in Week 6 of 2025. From that point forward, playing only 50% of the team's defensive snaps, he racked up 7.5 sacks. He finished the full season with 10.5 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, 42 total tackles, and 47 total pressures including the playoffs. He finished with the 6th highest pressure rate in the entire league at 17.3%. That is not a system player who only looks good in certain schemes. That is a player who, in the right context and with the right freedom, becomes a legitimate first-tier pass rush threat. Jesse Minter, who was the Chargers' defensive coordinator and is now the head coach in Baltimore, described exactly what unlocked it. They simplified some of what they were asking Oweh to do. They gave him more freedom as a pass rusher. They created an environment where he played with confidence. That is not schematic wizardry. That is smart coaching that recognizes what a player actually has and builds around it instead of forcing him into a mold. The real question now is whether Durante Jones can replicate that or go beyond it. Based on the analysis coming out of Hogs Haven, Jones is expected to use a 3-4 under hybrid front as his base defense. In that structure, the weak side edge rusher typically operates as a standing 7 technique, which gives Oweh the flexibility to attack from different angles instead of being locked into a fixed position. From there, Jones can morph that defense into what is called an amoeba or psycho front, where second level linebackers walk up to the line in a mugged look, creating pre-snap confusion for the quarterback and the offensive tackles. The offensive line has to adjust its slide protections in real time, and that frequently creates isolated one-on-one matchups on the outside where Oweh, with his closing speed and his toolbox of pass rush moves, including spin moves, cross chops, hand swipes, and bend around the corner, can take over. What Oweh described about Jones having variations of the same call is the most important tactical detail in this story. It means Washington can align in the same formation pre-snap and execute different concepts post-snap based on what the quarterback shows. That is disguised at a level that less experienced quarterbacks simply cannot solve quickly. And when the quarterback cannot solve the pre-snap look, the pass rusher's time to the QB gets shorter. And when the time gets shorter, Oweh with his 4.37 explosion and his power conversion becomes a problem that cannot be handled with one blocker. The honest weakness of this scheme, and I think it needs to be said, is that it is susceptible to quick passing and misdirection that exploits the spaces left by blitzers. If a quarterback can identify the look and release the ball before Oweh arrives, that neutralizes the rush. And if the secondary bites on a play-action fake or a misdirection, the damage can be significant. That is why minicamp and training camp are so critical for this defense. Oweh said it himself. The coordination and the collective understanding of why they are doing what they are doing is what separates a pressure front that works from one that falls apart. It is not magic. It is repetition, communication, and trust built over months of work. But if Jones builds that understanding with the group he has, bro, this could be a defense that genuinely changes football games for this team. Washington finished last season 5-12. A lot of that collapse was offensive, absolutely, with Daniels injured and 3 different quarterbacks starting, but the defense was also a problem. If Jones can extract from Oweh what Minter extracted in Los Angeles, this will be a defense that changes the numbers for this franchise in a dramatic way. And to close things out, something a little more low-key but with real implications for the season ahead. Mandatory minicamp is officially done, and Dan Quinn designed those 3 days in a very specific way that tells me something important about how this staff views the roster. Quinn was transparent from day one. He said exactly what he was doing. The players who had the most reps in OTAs were going to get the fewest in minicamp, and the ones who had less work earlier were going to get the most. At first glance, that sounds logical. But if you think about it for 2 minutes, what Quinn is actually communicating is this. He already knows what he has at the top of the roster. What he needed to evaluate is what he has at the bottom. And that has direct implications for the Tyreek Hill conversation and any other addition Washington makes before training camp opens. If the coaching staff is already in evaluation mode at the depth level this seriously in June, it means they understand that the road to the postseason in 2026 runs through not collapsing when injuries arrive. Because injuries will arrive. Quinn said it directly. It is not if they will need that depth, it is when. That is the mentality of a head coach who is building a team for 17 weeks, not for the first 4 games. The other side of this, which the coverage from SI identifies as the real cost of the minicamp structure, is that bubble players who got more opportunities also got more chances to put flaws on film. More reps against the starting unit means more footage for the coaches to evaluate exactly where everyone stands. Some of those players probably showed that that they can be the next man up. Others probably confirmed that their roster spot is shakier than they realized going into that week. The connection back to the broader picture is this. Wherever Washington lands on the Tyreek Hill decision, and whatever else Peters does before training camp, every move happens against the backdrop of a roster that is deeper and more competitive than it has been in years. Quinn is building something real in Ashburn. Minicamp did not decide anything, but it gave the staff more information than they had before. And in the NFL, information is the difference between making good decisions and making decisions based on gut feeling alone. That is everything I have for today, fam. I know we ended things with more questions than answers on some of this. That is just June in the NFL, but what I do know is that this franchise is operating differently than it was 2 years ago. Adam Peters makes decisions that have logic behind them. Dan Quinn is building culture the right way. Jaden Daniels has not come close to his ceiling yet, and that should terrify every team in the NFC. And if Tyreek Hill shows up to training camp healthy and motivated, the whole league is going to have to pay attention. This is the franchise of 90+ years of history, of championships, of John Riggins in the Super Bowl, of Darrell Green doing things that did not make physical sense, of Santana Moss going off in the Monday night comeback against the Giants. That DNA does not disappear after a bad season. Raise hail, always. If this video gave you something today, drop the like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments below. Would you sign Tyreek Hill knowing everything you know about his knee and his personal history? That question does not have an easy answer, and I genuinely want to read what you think. See you in the next one.